You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in.
a Mamma Mia podcast.
Hi, it's Mia. If you enjoyed my chat with magazine queen Nene King, you are going to love our new podcast, Extraordinary Stories. The first season is all about magazine queens and Nene's in it. Here's the first episode, and if you like it, head to mamamia.com.au/mplus to listen to more.
In a chaotic Sydney sharehouse in the spring of 1972, a dishevelled actor is lying naked on the fraying couch of an inner city living room. The woman who's paid Jack Thompson to do it is wondering if the actor's left hand is really big enough to cover his modesty and get her history-making magazine past the conservative censors who'll decide if it will make it to newsagent shelves.
On the day of the shoot, which was meant to be on the beach at Bondi, he had a terrible hangover and he didn't make the shoot. And Andrew Cowell, my art director, and Viv Jenkins, the photographer, knew that I would kill them if they came back without a photo because, we were very close to deadline. And so they go to Jack's place. He lived in an inner city suburb of Paddington here in Sydney. And they knock and he comes down the stairs and he's clearly not in the best shape. So he lies down on the couch and Andrew and Viv go out to get a coffee or something and they see an art shop and they go in there and Andrew's looking through the book and he sees the picture of Venus lying on the couch and he's thinking, that's it, we don't need to disturb Jack at all. We can just leave him lying there. We can recreate this painting. And that's what we did. And that's how we got the centrefold.
Ita Buttrose, $400, a bloke willing to drop his dax, a well-placed hand and an icon was born. Cleo Magazine.
Independent, you love to smile. You know yourself, you've got Cleo style.
This month, Cleo's Seal section gives you a complete guide to cosmetic surgery in Australia.
It must be Cleo.
Welcome to Magazine Queens, the first story from Extraordinary Stories, a podcast from Mamma Mia that takes you deep inside the stories you thought you knew with the people who really do. I'm your host, Emma Gillespie. Over the next 5 episodes, you'll hear how across 4 decades, one brave and bold decision at a time, a handful of Australian women became the most influential in the country, telling other women what to read, wear, think and buy, who to date, how to have sex, how to not get pregnant, how to get pregnant, how to vote. These women shaped generations, lined the pockets of some of the nation's richest men, were at the centre of some of the century's biggest stories, lived lives of sometimes unimaginable glamour, pressure, and yes, arguably destroyed a few reputations along the way.
We had these dresses that we had to shoot to put on the cover, and the models were so thin, and we still couldn't find models thin enough to get into the dress. They looked like christening robes. And I remember having dinner with a very top agent, and she said to me, yeah, no, it's a super thin season. Some of the girls have been eating tissues to try and keep their weight down.
There was no reason for me to talk to her. And of course, when I knocked her off, she was really pissed off.
We did open the door to all the possibilities that lay ahead for women.
We begin this extraordinary story in 1972. Australia was in a time of significant change. Decades of a Conservative Liberal government were about to end for the 13 million people who called Australia home. Recognition of the first Australians had finally been achieved in a 1967 referendum. Second wave feminism, known everywhere as women's lib, was a rapidly evolving work in progress after 10 years of the contraceptive pill.
In the 1960s, we'd seen a degree of student protests, opposition to the Vietnam War, change in terms of contraception becoming more available, changes in fashions, more women entering the workforce. There'd also been a long sort of period of stagnation politically.
That's Bridgette Griffin-Foley. She literally wrote the book on this stuff. Bridget is recognised as Australia's leading media historian. She's the author of several books, including The House of Packer, and she's a professor at Macquarie Uni. Bridget says by 1972 there was mounting pressure to pull out of the Vietnam War, with one man promising if the people of Australia made him their PM, he'd do just that.
Because it's intolerable that a free nation, at peace and not under threat, should cull by lottery the best of its youth to provide defence on the cheap.
Television is king in 1972, but with a few notable exceptions, women on it are relegated to a decorative role.
Graham Kennedy was always the sort of man who nurtured young talent. He enjoyed giving young people a chance. He mentored a lot of young people. You knew that if you went to his dressing room and it was locked, he'd be inside doing some mentoring.
The country's media landscape at that time was dominated by the towering presence of two men from two families: the Packers and the Murdochs. Frank Packer had just sold the Daily Telegraph to Rupert Murdoch for $15 million. The architects of that deal were his two sons, newsman Clyde and the ambitious Kerry. Both men eager to prove themselves worthy to their dad and to the world. Perhaps, Kerry thought, through magazines.
Clyde was always assumed to be the heir apparent to Frank Packer, but Sir Frank did bully both of his sons. Clyde perhaps was a little more fortunate in that, well, he was older, he was more intellectual. Having said that, he'd been denied the opportunity to go to university by Frank. Frank said you'll learn more in the School of Hard Knocks than you will at university. Clyde was also more involved with the journalism side of things, whereas Kerry was somewhat more involved in both the sort of production and business side of things. He wasn't a wordsmith, he was dyslexic, and he did have to live with this kind of label that followed him around, the idiot son, which is incredibly cruel.
The Packers want to launch Cosmopolitan in Australia. It's the most recognisable women's magazine in the world. And in 1972, its iconic American editor, Helen Gurley Brown, is well known for daring to suggest that women enjoy sex and making their own money, just like men.
So the original challenge was just to make it work. It was easier then, my darling, than it is now, because there weren't any others. I had sex all to myself. You couldn't mention it in another woman's magazine. And there I was with this precious, viable, fabulous commodity just for Cosmo.
But what would it mean to have a magazine like Cosmo featuring Australian voices, Australian women?
When Cleo came along and allowed women to explore ambitions and emotions and sexuality and health and all those issues that we looked at, I mean, we looked at important women's issues that were previously not canvassed in Australia. Because Australia in the 70s, when Cleo arrived, was a very strange place. I mean, women were not allowed to drink in public bars. There was no no-fault divorce. There was no maternity leave. Abortion was illegal and only allowed under the most extenuating of circumstances. And the pill, if you were single, many doctors wouldn't give you the pill. And a lot of married women used to trot along and get their pill. And then they'd say, oh, look, I've lost it. And they'd give it to their unmarried friends and then go back to the doctor to get another script. And you think, really? Were we that suppressed? Yes, we were.
Kerry and Frank Packer want a piece of this modern female reader and her rapidly increasing spending power. And in 1972, they are deep into a deal with Hearst Media to launch Cosmo, as it's universally known, in Australia. They've even hired a team to put it together, led by Ita Buttrose. But then, at the 11th hour, the packers are gazumped. The Cosmo rights go to Fairfax Media, and Frank and Kerry are left with the perfect team and no magazine. What happens next is, well, history.
In 1972, Kerry really takes the initiative to steal the thunder of Fairfax and try to bring out a magazine that would undercut Cosmopolitan. And he takes a big risk. And Frank Packer, although he was hugely competitive and was horrified by Fairfax getting the rights to Cosmopolitan from Hearst, he's totally bemused by the idea of this new women's magazine. And Ita famously tells the story of Sir Frank thinking that this new magazine could be called something like the Australian Women's Monthly, and she has to explain to Sir Frank as gently as possible the difference between a period and a periodical.
Well, Sir Frank still owned the newspapers when he got the idea of us doing an Australian version of Cosmopolitan. And he thought that I could edit the Australian version. And that was the deal. And then he sold the newspapers to Rupert Murdoch. And I was told to keep the people back that I thought would be suitable for the new magazine. They knew about the Cosmo deal. And the rest of the employees all went down to News Limited, down on Holt Street, not far from Castlereagh Street, where the telegraphs were. And then the building emptied and we sat there. There we were, just a few people. And we started designing magazines because really we had nothing else to do. And one of them was a magazine which we'd call Cleopatra. But I never thought the deal with Cosmopolitan wouldn't happen. It was with Hearst, the American publisher. But at the last moment, they decided they wouldn't do the magazine with us. And the packers don't like losing a deal. They were not happy about this. So Kerry tells me the news. I'm thinking, gosh, this is dreadful. Cosmo, I'm not going to do the job. What have you been doing up there? He said, And I said, well, we've been designing magazines. Let me see what you've been doing. So I brought them down, all of them. There was a man's magazine and a gardening magazine and a kids magazine and Cleopatra. He said, let me see that one. He started looking through it. And we'd put a lot of cartoons in there, because it always had a sense of humour. Well, certainly in the early days it did. And he started to laugh at the jokes. He's laughing away. And then he said, this is it. We'll do this one. I want you to do this one, and I want it out 6 months ahead of Cosmo.
To understand our first magazine queen's influence on the media landscape, we need to take a step back to a 15-year-old girl from Sydney's Potts Point with the dream of becoming editor of the Australian Women's Weekly. The jewel in the crown of the Packer media empire, Australian Consolidated Press, or ACP. Ita was an ambitious young girl with a fire in her belly, someone born with a desire to be her own person, who knew at just 11 years old that she wanted to become a journalist.
I think I had that urge from a very young age to be independent. I got married when I was 21, and when my prospective husband met my father to discuss my hand, my father said I remember that, he said to my husband-to-be, you're marrying a very independent young woman. So it must have just been a trait I was born with, I think.
At age 15, the independent young Miss Buttrose left school for a position at the Women's Weekly, the very publication she would one day become editor of.
There was a job there as a copy girl, and I had done 3 months at a shorthand and typing college. My mother said I had to have skills, so I'd learnt shorthand and typing. But I heard about this job going, and I thought, gosh, my foot in the door, I can get my foot in the door. So I applied for the job as a copy girl on the Weekly, and I got it. And, it's about as low as you can start. It meant that you ran messages and you made 10 coffee for 40 people in the morning and the afternoon, and you picked up people's lunch and all those sorts of things that you did as a messenger. But to my mind, it was so exciting, and I earned £4, 9 shillings and 6pence, which seemed a lot of money to me then.
After more than a decade of hard work and determination, Ita Buttrose would become one of the most important names on the ACP payroll. In a company where Sir Frank was seen as godlike, Ita says she wasn't intimidated.
I didn't have any notion of the Packers. And I met Sir Frank Packer, but I think he was only Mr. Packer when I met him. He hadn't been knighted yet, in the elevator. And I didn't know who he was. I'm a fairly confident young woman, and I was a confident young girl, and I started talking to him. I can't even remember what we were talking about, but I was talking to him respectfully because he was obviously an older man. And the rest of the lift, when he got out, they looked at me and said, "Do you know who that was?" And I said, "No, who was that?" And they said, "That was Mr. Packer." Well, I didn't know. I just treated him like a normal human being.
Obviously, Ita had made an impression. But by the time Frank's son Kerry told her to make Cleo happen, well, it was still a huge risk. Cleo couldn't have been further from the beloved heart of the Packer media empire, the Australian Women's Weekly. The weekly was launched by Sir Frank in 1933. It was, and it still is, the prototype for a respectable women's magazine.
By this stage, it is still selling extremely well, but it's a magazine that is full of what we might now think of as the kind of traditional features of women's magazines. It's full of recipes and fashion patterns. It publishes fiction. It's very interested in the royal family. So it's becoming perhaps a little bit dated or sedate, or maybe somewhat more targeted at sort of middle-aged readers.
Kerry might have seen Cleo as the ticket to trump Cosmo, but not everyone thought it was a great idea.
They also told us not to do it. They said it would fail. They'd sort of gathered together groups of hardline feminists, and they hated the mock-up. But you see, the magazine was never meant for hardline feminists. It was meant for middle-class Australia, where the biggest changes of women's liberation actually took place. That's where women's lib impacted. It was middle-class women who thought, oh, hang on a moment, I can go out to work. I can have ambition. I can be married. I can have children. I can do these things. As Helen Reddy said in that song, that memorable song of the 70s, I am woman, I can do anything. And we believed all that. And that's why Cleo worked, really, because it appealed to middle-class Australia. But I had to go upstairs and tell the team, who were still thinking we were doing Cosmo, hey, we're not doing Cosmopolitan, explain, but we are doing this one.
Ita was a woman who knew to trust her gut, even when the odds might have felt stacked against her.
Kerry told me to take it upstairs and hide it, not to mention it to Sir Frank, and I didn't, and I hid it. I don't know that Sir Frank ever knew that there was research saying, do not do this project, it will fail. And I think that's why I've always looked at research fairly. I never totally accept it. I always allow room for error, because if the researchers get you the wrong groups, you don't necessarily get the result that you want. In my gut feel, and I think Kerry had gut feel about this as well, in our gut, we felt this magazine would work. We thought Cleo was the right magazine at the right time. We were part of the change that was taking place, and Cleo reflected that.
You're listening to episode 1 of Magazine Queens, a series from the Extraordinary Stories podcast.
This month, Cleo Magazine talks to Don Dunstan, South Australia's dynamic premier, and that's only the beginning.
By the time it launches, Cleo has beaten Cosmo to print and sells out. It's a hit and quickly establishes itself as the magazine for young women around Australia. Ita was the face of Cleo in the way that Helen Gurley Brown was the face of American Cosmopolitan, and it cemented the style in which the magazine queens were going to continue as the aspirational faces of their brands, as celebrities as much as the famous faces on their covers, as part of the dream.
Ita Buttrose's editorial judgment has turned 250,000 news agency customers into regular buyers of Cleo in a little over 2 years.
Why can't we ever get them smiling? They always look as though they're going to a bloody funeral.
I think they get tensed or something. Yeah.
This is a time when women are becoming more active in every sense, during an era when hopes for social and political change are high. And Ita did represent that. Despite what she'd told Sir Frank back when he wanted to hire her at the Telegraph, that she wasn't going to be having children anytime soon, Ita did have babies, and one of them when she was just about to launch Cleo. There hadn't been a template for this before. A high-profile working mother who worked when she was pregnant, who in the mid-70s separated from her husband and became a single working mother. Ita truly was an icon for a new era. And people, well, they loved her and her magazine. In 2 days, 105,000 copies of the first issue of Cleo were sold. And by the end of its first year, circulation reached 200,000. When the magazine conducted the first national readership survey in 1974, figures revealed that 30% of women aged between 13 and 24 read Cleo every month. 30%. Ita was an instant star, a woman who only needed one name.
Every night when I grow home, I settle down to primetime limbo. When all the boys are gathered around, shouting Ita's on TV.
It was a level of fame Ita never expected, and one she worked hard to protect her children from.
I never envisaged the sort of career that I've had, and I certainly didn't as a young woman. I certainly think perhaps there was a time somewhere in my 20s when I realised I could go a lot further with my career than I had imagined. But I never thought about the notoriety, as you put it, or the fame, if we could put it another way. I never thought about that. You don't realise what it means actually to lose your anonymity until you lose it. And I've been in the public eye for so many years now that I'm used to it. But it is quite enjoyable sometimes to go to a country where I'm not known and to be able to walk down the street with no one looking at me because I don't notice it. My bad friends say, "Don't you notice?" And I said, "No, I don't notice," because you can't notice. You have to get on with your life. And I think if you're going to be well known, Australia's a pretty good place because Australians are friendly. You know, when my kids were little, if they'd see me out with my kids, they wouldn't intrude. Australians are very courteous people, I think. They never intruded on those very personal moments when they could see that I was having a mother's moment with my kids. There was Ita Buttrose, who went to work and was in magazines, and then there was me, Mum, and I was very different. My son Ben, he used to say things like, he'd say, "Mum, Ita Buttrose is on television."
Hello, I'm Ita Buttrose.
But it wasn't all easy for our magazine queen. Ask anyone about Kerry Packer and chances are they'll tell you some horror stories. Kerry has been represented in Australian folklore as a ruthless tyrant if you crossed him.
You want to see me?
Hers went with Fairfax. Idiot!
Because my work's perfect for us.
I know how it could have worked.
But was that the truth? Ita says she saw Kerry's famous temper once and never again.
It was when we were changing the size of the Women's Weekly, because I went to the Weekly to change its size. It used to be a tabloid. And we had to bring it down to the standard size, which is the common size for most magazines. And we decided we would run some photographs of the past, some of the brilliant things that we'd done. We had a grading system for colour photographs. So, you know, the A+ was going to be a good result, B was something, C, you know, that sort of thing. One of the pictures that we had was a picture of the Sarah Quads. That was a family that the Women's Weekly adopted. And we followed the Quads' amazing life and their mother, Betty Sarah. And there was a wonderful old photograph of the family and the Quads that I found, and I dropped it into this sort of supplement that we were putting into the New Size Weekly. And it wasn't the best quality film. You know, it had been taken a long time ago, and it was the best one that we had. Kerry's out at Compress, our printing factory, and he sees this. He's not happy with the quality of the picture. They ring me from the factory to tell me that he's coming back and he's really in a terrible mood. You know, he's seen this photograph. It's not. So I get the summons to go down to him. And he berates me for using this photograph. And I'm saying to him, but look, it's just one photograph of many. And it was the only one we had. And, you know, he's going to reckon. But I realised, you know, he was really nervous about what we were doing because this was huge change that we were making to the Weekly, the flagship. then the cash cow of the company. And he was very nervous that, anything we did that wasn't up to scratch might be detrimental to the success of the changeover. Well, he went on and on and on and on and on, and I finally said to him, could you please pass me the tissues? I wasn't really crying, just a tear sort of trickled it. And he stopped at once. And I think I might have said, look, I think it'll be all right. And I left. And it was all right, as it turned out. I mean, nobody noticed the photograph. Everyone thought, oh, isn't that nice, the nostalgia of it. And the New Look Weekly sold over 1 million copies, the first time it had ever sold over 1 million. So all was good. That's the only time he ever raised his voice. But, hindsight tells you why. He was just nervous.
There's a tendency to see Kerry as a monodimensional, raging tyrant, the great Citizen Kane type of press baron, always pounding the desk and, hurling abuse at minions. But he was a much more complex picture than that.
That's Kerry's former lawyer and former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, speaking to ABC's Australian Story. Despite being born into newspaper royalty, the childhood of Kerry Francis Bulmore Packer was less than perfect. He wasn't close with his parents. He grew up outside the family mansion, instead bouncing between boarding school and relatives in Bowral. His insecurities about his parents were made worse after he contracted polio at just 6 years old at a boarding school in the New South Wales Southern Highlands in 1945. That little boy got out of bed one morning and fell flat on his face. He was rushed to hospital in Sydney, where he would remain for some 9 months before spending a further 2 years in Canberra recovering. Neither Kerry's mum nor dad had much time to visit him when he was suffering from polio. Polio left one side of Kerry's face palsied, and he'd become convinced that everyone could see it. He began to think of himself as the Elephant Man.
And then I went back to school at Cranbrook, of course at this point hopelessly behind everybody else, and became a bit of a laughing stock because of it. It was a very tough period for a kid.
Being dyslexic earned him the label of the dumb son. His own father? He called him a buffhead. When Kerry's brother Clyde decided he'd had enough of Sir Frank's overbearing nature, the so-called buffhead stepped up to the plate. Kerry might have landed there by accident, but this was an opportunity to prove to his father once and for all that he was more valuable than he'd been given credit for. So that raging tyrant that everyone saw seems to be somewhat of a myth, at least to those closest to him. Those who would help him succeed so he could show his family once and for all he was a packer. A packer that could make money, and lots of it. Back to Cleo. Back to the centrefold. Back to that grotty living room in Paddington and the naked man on the couch.
Yes, how close we were not to having a centrefold. It was so hard to get men to pose. I mean, honestly, Australian blokes are so full of bravado. And you say, right, would you like to be a centrefold? And they go, and they back off and run a mile. But Jack was different. He said yes, so we couldn't believe our good fortune.
Of course, one of the more outrageous things that Cleo did in the 70s was bring the male centrefold to masses of women. Bridgette Griffin-Foley says it was spectacular publicity, but the magazine did so much more than that.
The first male centrefold is quite a departure, and really what it does is turn the male gaze on the objectified female form. It just totally reverses that, and it did also reverse the objectification of women in bikinis or less that you would see in some men's magazines such as Playboy. At the same time, there was some quite serious content in Cleo. There were articles about professional women, articles about contraception, there were articles about sexual satisfaction, orgasms, etc.
The centrefold lasted until 1985, when then editor Lisa Wilkinson decided it was past its time. The last man to derobe for the female gaze in Cleo, Mel Gibson. Lisa says it was a decision that Kerry wasn't thrilled with, but one that she believed was important for Cleo's future. Here she is on Arndo's Brush with Fame.
And he said, I'm not, I'm back. I just saw you on the midday show. What the are you doing to my magazine? And I said, Kerry, anyone who thinks that this magazine needs to languish in the 70s any longer shouldn't be working in magazines. The centrefold has got to go.
Cleo was a trailblazing magazine, led by one woman who knew who she was and used her killer instinct to bring her readers something they'd never seen before. Frank sex advice and sealed sections, alongside thoughtful coverage of political and social issues. Its message was bold yet simple, that women could take charge of their lives and be anything they wanted. Get an education, forge a career, be an engaged citizen, be single if they wanted, find love if they so wished, make decisions about their lives and their bodies independently.
It took 7 months of that magazine before we could get the circulation right because we kept selling out. It just went like hotcakes. Up in Queensland, they used to have a thing called the Literature Board of Review. And it would review titles and magazines, and they'd got to hear about the centrefold, and they weren't all that happy. They thought this was a bit too much maybe for Queensland. So I had to go and front them. And they were a group of very serious-minded, middle-aged people. I don't think they approved of me at all, and they certainly didn't approve of Cleo or Jack as a centrefold. And I explained that the centrefold was quite modest, that Jack's hand was covering his penis. That still wasn't enough for Queensland. We had to put a brick over Jack's hand so that you couldn't even imagine what might be under it actually. Well, you could, but it was difficult. So I made it a gold brick, and we sent 10,000 copies of that issue up to Queensland, and it sold out too. And so there we are, the team and I, we were having a story conference about the second issue, working out, what we're going to do. And Kerry comes breezing into the office. He's very pleased with us. I mean, we are number one here because we've actually proved to his father that Kerry can produce a success, because Cleo was really his baby. I mean, Sir Frank just handed it over to him because, as we've just discussed, he didn't think the magazine was going to work. So Kerry was in his old man's good books. So he says, who's the second centrefold? And we all look at him blankly and we say, what? Oh, yes, he said, you've got to continue. I mean, it's a great hit. You can't. We're thinking, God, we've got to get another bloke, another body. And so we said, right, okay, not letting him know that this was really a difficult task. And so then it became a fixture.
That first centrefold was iconic, but it wasn't the only reason readers kept coming back for more. Cleo was setting a new standard for women to sit in the driver's seat and have more control.
We were so suppressed. We were expected to stay where we were put and to keep our mouths shut. It was just extraordinary. And so this was the Australia that Cleo breathed new life into and challenged women to think about their options. We didn't hate men, we weren't anti-marriage, and we certainly weren't anti those women who chose to make their roles in the home, because it was as much as that. Some women felt quite guilty that they had chosen to stay in the home. But we felt that to take a hard line on that would be the wrong way to go, because we were going through a change, and change takes time for everybody. And so it was much better to say, no, look, you're not just a housewife. No one's just a housewife. You run a budget. You stick to the budget. You have all these commitments. You do voluntary work. You man things at children's school and the fetes and all those things that happen. We tried to make it as even-handed as we could, but we did open the door to all the possibilities that lay ahead for women, and particularly if we remained educated, if we got educated and we encouraged girls, and I continued this when I went on to the Weekly, encouraged girls to study mathematics, economics and science.
Ita had delivered the Packers a rolled gold hit, an era-defining magazine, lots of advertising dollars, and a credible reputation as publishers who knew women. Now, they needed more. Ita finally left the iconic 54 Park Street offices in 1981 for the Grittier News Limited offices to become the first female editor of a metropolitan paper and the first woman on Murdoch's board. And as she left the building, a different kind of coronation was being planned in magazine land. The undisputed queen of Australia's weekly magazines was about to be challenged by one of her own.
From my point of view, he likes success. He also likes loyalty. So I was successful, I was loyal to the company, and I did very well.
And as the Packers pulled out their checkbooks to earn their new star, a young woman on the other side of the world was putting on a tiara, marrying a man who was in love with someone else, and setting the scene for the most ruthless tabloid battle of the century. Thank you for listening to this episode of Extraordinary Stories. The first 2 episodes are available for free wherever you get your podcasts. All future episodes will be available exclusively to Mamamia's new membership mplus. To learn more about mplus or become a member, head to mamamia.com.au/mplus. That's MPLUS. Extraordinary Stories was written and produced by me, Emma Gillespie, and Mel Zauer with Holly Wainwright. Audio production is by Eliza Ratliff and Madeline Joannou. The executive producers of Extraordinary Stories are Eliza Ratliff and Holly Wainwright. We'll see you next time.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.